The Lost Archivist's testimony. My supervisor was not human. The following testimony was submitted to our archives by a man identifying himself as Arthur Coleman, a former senior archivist for the Northern Geological Archive, a privately funded institution operating in the remote upper territories of North America. Shortly after we received this manuscript and its accompanying materials, all of Mr. Coleman's digital footprints ceased. His current whereabouts are unknown. The account details his 30-year career under a single supervisor, a man he claims never aged, and a disturbing set of rules he discovered, a protocol for survival that he believes is the only reason he is alive to tell this tale. We have been unable to independently verify his claims. All inquiries with the Northern Geological Archive regarding a Mr. Alastair Finch have been met with official denials of his employment during the period specified. What you are about to hear is his story in his own words. My name is Arthur Coleman. In the autumn of 1988, my life truly began. Or perhaps that is when it was signed away. I was 25 years old, filled with the kind of quiet, academic ambition that only a degree in library science and a minor in geology can instill. I had secured a position at the Northern Geological Archive, a place spoken of in hushed, reverent tones within my small circle. It was not a government entity, but a sanctuary of stone and data, funded by a consortium of powerful corporations who sought to map, understand, and ultimately exploit the vast, silent North. The archive itself was a monument to brutalist architecture, a formidable block of reinforced concrete set down in the middle of an endless sea of pine and birch. It was designed for one purpose: permanence. To protect its priceless contents from fire, from flood, from the ravages of time itself. Inside, the air was cool, dry, and smelled of old paper, the faint ozone hum of climate control systems, and something clean, sterile, like the air after a lightning strike. The silence was the most profound feature. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a heavy, weighted silence, filled with the patient gravity of millions of years compressed into rock cores and seismic charts. On my first day, I was led down a long, echoing corridor to the director's office. This was where I would meet the man who would define my professional life, who would become the central, unmoving pillar around which my own 30 years would pivot. His name was Mr. Alastair Finch. His office was an extension of the archive itself, meticulously ordered, Spartan, yet exuding a sense of immense control. The books on his shelves were perfectly aligned. The pens on his desk lay in a precise parallel formation. He stood as I entered, a gesture of professional courtesy that somehow felt like a calculated assessment. My first impression was of a man in his prime. Late 40s, I guess maybe 50 at the outside. He possessed a severe academic handsomeness. His hair was thick, impeccably parted, and the color of iron phalanxa distinguished salt and pepper that suggested wisdom and experience. His face was a collection of sharp, intelligent lines, the face of a man who did not suffer fools gladly. He was dressed in what I would come to recognize as his uniform: a dark tweed jacket, a crisp white shirt, and a simple dark tie. But it was his eyes that truly held you. They were a pale, washed-out blue, the unnerving color of a winter sky reflected on a vast, frozen lake. They were calm, utterly still, and seemed to look not just at you, but through you, cataloging you with the same dispassionate precision with which we cataloged our stone samples. "Mr. Coleman," he said. His voice was a perfectly modulated baritone, resonating with a quiet authority that required no volume to command respect. It was a voice without any discernible accent, as if it had been scrubbed clean of any regional identity. "Welcome to the archive. We pride ourselves on precision, patience, and permanence. I trust you'll find your place here." He shook my hand. His grip was firm, but his skin was startlingly cool and dry, like holding a polished river stone. The feeling was so distinct that I remember it with perfect clarity even now. And for the first few years, I did find my place. I was a good archivist. I reveled in the quiet, meticulous work. I learned the labyrinthine shelving systems, the delicate handling of brittle, 100-year-old survey maps, the specific atmospheric conditions required to prevent geological samples from degrading. I was content. The world outside the archive's thick concrete walls could continue its chaotic spin. Inside, there was only order, logic, and the slow, comforting march of geological time. My own life progressed along a predictable human trajectory. In my 3rd year, I married a wonderful woman, a schoolteacher named Sarah. We bought a small house in the town 20 miles away, the closest settlement to the archive. I watched my hairline begin a slow, strategic retreat. Laughter lines appeared around my eyes. Colleagues came and went. Eager young geologists would burn brightly for a few years before the isolation got to them, and they'd move on. Older archivists, men with skin like parchment and fingers stained with archival dust, would work until their quiet retirement, which was usually marked by weak coffee and a sheet cake in the break room. I was living a life. I was aging, but Mr. Finch was not. It wasn't a sudden realization. It was a creeping, insidious observation that wormed its way into my subconscious over several years. The human mind is excellent at normalizing its surroundings. You see the same person every day, and you don't notice the subtle, incremental shifts of aging. But with Mr. Finch, there were no shifts to notice. The baseline never changed. The first time the wrongness of it all struck me with physical force was at the annual Christmas party in my 7th year. It was a typically subdued affair, held in the main reading room under the buzz of fluorescent lights, the festive spirit embodied by a few sad strings of tinsel. On my desk, in my small cubicle, I kept a framed photograph from my first week of work. It was a picture of myself and Mr. Finch, taken for the employee newsletter. In it, I am 25 years old, rail-thin, with a nervous, eager smile plastered on my face. Mr. Finch stands beside me, looking exactly as I first saw him. Late 40s, iron-gray hair, pale, watchful eyes. That evening, I glanced from the photograph on my desk across the room to where the real, present-day Mr. Finch was speaking with a new junior researcher. The light from the overhead fixtures caught his profile in precisely the same way as the flash had in the photograph 7 years prior. I felt a dizzying wave of cognitive dissonance. It was as if I was looking at a painting and its subject simultaneously, separated by a 7-year gulf, yet they were utterly, impossibly indistinguishable. There was not one additional line on his face. His hair was the exact same shade of iron and salt. The gray had not advanced an inch from his temples. The sharp line of his jaw had not softened in the slightest. The man across the room was a perfect, living replica of the man in the 7-year-old photograph. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I dismissed it, of course. My mind scrambled for rational explanations. Good genes. An exceptionally healthy lifestyle. A trick of the light, a quirk of my memory. Some people just age incredibly well. But the observation, once made, refused to be forgotten. It became an intellectual splinter, lodged just beneath the surface of my daily thoughts. Once you see something like that, you start to look for it. And I saw it everywhere. At our quarterly budget reviews, I started discreetly pulling the annual reports from previous years. Each report began with a staff photograph. Year by year, I watched the faces of my colleagues change. I saw our receptionist, Brenda, go from a young woman to a middle-aged mother. I saw our head of maintenance, Gary, grow a beard, then shave it, his face becoming fuller and more lined with each passing year. I watched my own face soften, my youthful sharpness giving way to the gentle bloating of my 30s. We were a portrait of human entropy. But in the center of each photograph, Mr. Finch was the control variable. The constant. The man from 1988 was the man from 1993, who was the man from 1998. Unchanged. A stony island in our river of decay. This central, impossible fact began to color other observations. Things I had noticed but dismissed as mere quirks of personality. There was his unnatural stillness. Most people fidget. They tap their fingers, bounce a knee, scratch an ear. Mr. Finch did not. I remember watching him one afternoon through the glass partition of his office. He was reviewing a complex geological map spread across his desk. For a full 17 minutes, a period I timed on my watch, he did not move a single muscle, save for the slow, deliberate travel of his eyes across the paper. It wasn't the stillness of concentration. It was the stillness of something inorganic, a beautifully crafted automaton waiting for its next command. Then there was the food. In a decade of working alongside him, of sharing the same break room, of attending the same tedious holiday parties, I never once saw Mr. Finch eat anything. Not a sandwich, not a piece of fruit, not even a slice of the celebratory cakes that were a fixture of our small social gatherings. It was Brenda's 50th birthday. We had a large Black Forest cake. She personally took a slice to Mr. Finch's office. I saw him smile, a rare and bloodless thing, and thank her warmly. He praised the look of the cake, the skill of the baker. But when she offered him the plate, he simply held up a hand and said, in his perfectly modulated voice, "Thank you, Brenda, but I find I function best on a simpler regimen." The phrasing was just slightly off, just alien enough to be unsettling. The slice of cake sat on the corner of his desk for the rest of the afternoon, untouched, before it disappeared, presumably into the trash can. His immunity to the brutal northern winters was another anomaly. Our winters were no small thing. The temperature would plummet to 40 degrees below zero, with winds that felt like they were flaying the skin from your face. The short walk from the heated parking garage to the archive's main entrance was a mad dash for survival. We were human burritos, swaddled in layers of thermal underwear, down-filled parkas, and thick wool scarves. Mr. Finch would stride that same path in nothing but his tweed jacket, his iron-gray hair unruffled by the gale, his face calm and untroubled by the biting cold, as if the very concept of temperature was a matter of indifference to him. By the end of my first decade, in the winter of 1998, my quiet, comfortable life had a dark secret at its core. My rational mind, the mind of a librarian and a man of science, was at war with what my eyes told me every single day. The small oddities were no longer small. They had coalesced like iron filings drawn to a powerful, unseen magnet into a single terrifying certainty. My supervisor, Mr. Alistair Finch, was not subject to the same laws of biology that governed me and every other human being I knew. The archive was no longer a sanctuary of quiet knowledge. It had become a gallery where I was forced to observe a single, impossible exhibit, day after day. The problem was, I was beginning to feel like I was part of the collection, and the terror was rooted in a simple, unavoidable question. If he doesn't age, what am I doing here? Why does he need employees who do? The thought was a cold stone in the pit of my stomach. My first decade had been defined by a subtle unreality. I was afraid of what the second would bring. You are listening to the testimony of Arthur Coleman, a former archivist who spent 30 years at the remote Northern Geological Archive. In our previous installment, Mr. Coleman described his first decade of service under his supervisor, Mr. Alistair Finch, a man who, by all appearances, had not aged a single day since Arthur was hired in 1988. What began as a subtle, creeping unease had, by the end of his first 10 years, solidified into a disturbing certainty. Now a family man in his late 30s, Arthur realized that the static nature of his superior was not a quirk of genetics, but a profound violation of natural law. He was no longer just a content employee. He was a silent observer of an impossibility. We now present the second part of his account, detailing the decade in which quiet observation turned into a fearful, clandestine investigation. The second decade of my employment, from 1998 to 2008, began with the world holding its breath for the new millennium. People were preoccupied with the Y2K bug, with the end of a century, with the forward rush of history. My own life was also rushing forward. My daughter was born in '99. My son followed 2 years later. I was now a father in his 40s. I had a mortgage, 2 car payments, and the quiet weight of responsibility that settles on a man in midlife. I could feel the years accumulating. I saw them in the mirror every morning, the deepening furrows of my brow, the silver that now decisively outmatched the brown in my hair. But at the heart of my orderly life was the archive. And at the heart of the archive was Mr. Finch. The turn of the century meant nothing to him. He was still the man from 1988. By my original estimation, he should have been entering his 60s. He looked at the very oldest 50, and that was a generous assessment. The polite consensus in the break room had long since evaporated, replaced by a quiet, unspoken strangeness. No one joked about it anymore. Mr. Finch's agelessness had become a piece of institutional furniture, something everyone was aware of, but no one dared to comment on. The splinter of unease from my first decade had festered. It was no longer enough to simply notice. I had to know. I became a spy in my own workplace. My methodical nature, the very trait that made me a good archivist, was now repurposed for a terrifying new project. To uncover the truth of Alistair Finch, a truth I suspected was not written in any human language. My investigation began where all archival research begins, with the records. As a senior archivist, I had clearance levels that gave me access to personnel files, provided I could log a plausible reason. I created a phantom project in the Systman Internal Review of Long-Term Staffing and Directorate History. It sounded just bureaucratic and boring enough to avoid scrutiny. One Tuesday afternoon, when I knew the administrative staff had left for the day, I locked my office door, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and I pulled his file. The folder for Alistair Finch felt unnaturally cold in my hands. It was shockingly thin, a single sheet of cardstock yellowed with age. His name, his position, and his start date. October 12, 1958. I had to read the date 3 times. The ink was faded, written in a precise, elegant cursive from a bygone era. 1958. I did the math, my mind numb with disbelief. If he had started as a young man of, say, 22, straight out of university, he would have been born in 1936. That meant when he hired me in 1988, he wasn't in his late 40s, he was 52. Plausible, just. But now, in 2003, it meant he was 67 years old. The man whose office was 50 feet from mine, the man with the smooth, severe face and thick iron-gray hair, was not a day over 50. The numbers didn't just fail to add up. They described a physical impossibility. The rest of the file was a void. Under place of birth, it simply said, not applicable. Under next of kin, the same. There was no prior employment history, no references. It was the file of a ghost. It was as if Alistair Finch had simply stepped out of the northern fog in 1958, fully formed, and assumed his place within these concrete walls. His promotions were listed in that same neat cursive. Archivist, 1962. Head of Collections, 1968. Director, 1975. He had been director for 13 years before I even arrived. He had worked here for 45 years. My hands were shaking. This wasn't just a case of aging well. This was something else entirely. I needed visual proof. The archive, in its obsessive compulsion to document everything, was its own historian. In a climate-controlled vault in the sub-basement, we kept the institutional records, photographs, newsletters, blueprints. I went there the next night, armed with a flashlight and a fabricated work order. I pulled a heavy, leather-bound album labeled Staff, 1958 to 1965. The black and white photos smelled of fixer chemicals and time. And there he was, in the 1959 annual staff photograph, standing in the back row amongst men in thin ties and women with beehive hairdos. He was unmistakable. The same pale, piercing eyes, the same sharp bone structure. But he was younger. His hair was a solid, lustrous black. He looked perhaps 25, 26 years old. A handsome, serious young man. I felt a wave of vertigo so profound I had to lean against the cold metal shelving. The photograph proved it. The file was correct. I pulled another album. Staff, 1966 to 1972. I found the photo for 1967. There he was again, now in the middle row. More confident. He looked to be in his mid-30s. The first hint of change was visible. Distinguished flecks of silver were beginning to appear at his temples. The first salting of the iron into the black. He was aging. He was on a normal trajectory. My fingers trembled as I reached for the next volume. Staff, 1973 to 1980. I turned the pages, my breath catching in my throat. I found the photo for 1978. 3 years after he was promoted to director, and I froze. There he was, the man I knew, the man who had hired me, the man who sat down the hall for me at this very moment. Late 40s, the hair no longer black with flecks of gray, but a perfect, even blend of iron and salt. The face was set in those familiar, severe, handsome lines. It was him. He had arrived at a specific point, a pinnacle of distinguished middle-aged authority, and then the process had simply stopped. For the last 25 years, he had been frozen in the amber of that single image from 1978. My investigation now had a new, terrifying focus. If he was an anomaly, what about the people who had worked closest to him for the longest time? My own predecessor, a man named Joseph Miller, came to mind. The official story I'd heard as a new hire was that Joe had worked here for 40 years, then retired suddenly in the summer of '88 to move south and live with his daughter. It had been an abrupt departure, I recalled an older colleague once mentioning. No party, no farewell, just gone. Using the archive's powerful internet connect Iona tool, Finch seemed to regard with austere disdain, but which he permitted for official research. I started digging. It wasn't easy. Miller is a common name, but after weeks of late-night searches, cross-referencing locations and professions, I found it. An obituary from a small-town newspaper in Arizona, dated 1995. Joseph Miller, a beloved father and grandfather, formerly a distinguished archivist, had passed away at the age of 71, 7 years after his happy retirement. The cause of death listed was complications from rapid-onset Alzheimer's disease. A chill that had nothing to do with the archive's air conditioning crept down my spine. I dug deeper. Who was Joe's predecessor as head of collections? A woman named Eleanor Vance. Her personnel file noted an early retirement in 1977 due to nervous exhaustion. A quick search of public death records found her. She died in 1980, 3 years after leaving. A massive, debilitating stroke. She was 63. And the man before her, and the woman before him, the pattern was undeniable and it was horrifying. Long-serving senior employees, people who spent decades working directly under Alistair Finch, did not get happy endings. Their retirements were a prelude to a swift and catastrophic decline, a sudden fraying of the mind or body. It was as if they had spent their lives charging a battery, and upon their departure the power was cut, causing an immediate and total system collapse. The archive was no longer my workplace. It was a crime scene, and I was the sole, terrified detective. Every mundane interaction became charged with dread. When Mr. Finch would pass me in the hall and offer a curt, "Good day, Arthur," I felt a predator's gaze sizing me up. His cold office felt like a mausoleum. Then came the incident that shattered the last vestiges of my rational mind. It was during a particularly savage winter storm. The power lines went down, and for the first time in my memory, the backup generators failed to engage. The entire facility was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness and silence. The only illumination came from the faint, eerie green glow of the emergency exit signs. I was in one of the deep storage vaults, cross-referencing core samples. I had a small LED flashlight on my keychain. Its beam was weak, cutting a pathetic little circle in the oppressive blackness. As I made my way down a central aisle, between two towering shelves of rock cores, my light caught him. Mr. Finch. He was standing in the middle of the aisle, his back partially to me. He wasn't trying to find his way out. He was just standing there. His right hand was pressed flat against the side of one of the massive industrial steel shelving units, a unit that weighed several tons and was bolted directly into the reinforced concrete floor. But he wasn't just touching it. The beam of my light caught the faint gleam of stressed metal. The shelf was visibly groaning, dented inward where his palm rested flat against it. It was the effortless, horrifying indentation you might see if a hydraulic press was applied to sheet metal. And from him, there came a low, resonant hum. It wasn't a vocal sound. It was deeper, a vibration I could feel in the floor and in the bones of my teeth. I swept the light up to his face, and for the first and only time, his mask of calm composure was gone. His eyes were closed, and his face was a portrait of intense, ecstatic concentration. And in the absolute darkness of the vault, his skin, it seemed to glow. It was a faint, sickly, phosphorescent luminescence, like foxfire on rotting wood. My breath caught in a strangled gasp. I clicked off my flashlight, plunging myself back into the darkness. I was terrified he had seen the light, terrified he had heard me. I flattened myself against the opposing shelf, my heart hammering so violently I was sure the vibrations would give me away. I stood there, not daring to breathe, for what felt like an eternity. Then, the emergency lights flickered, buzzed, and flooded the corridor with a sterile white light. I blinked, my eyes adjusting. I peered down the aisle. He was gone. With trembling legs, I forced myself to walk to the spot where he had been standing. I ran my hand over the shelving unit. There, pressed into the thick industrial steel, was a perfect, deep indentation of a hand. The metal within the print was unnaturally cold. Colder than the surrounding steel, colder than the chilled air of the vault. A residual, life-draining cold. I went home that night a changed man. I looked at my wife, my sleeping children, and I saw them through a new lens of fear. I was not just a man with a strange boss. I was an employee of something ancient, something impossibly strong, something that wore the skin of Alistair Finch. And the most terrifying realization of all washed over me in a cold wave. I was now in my 20th year of service. I was a senior employee. I was one of the long-serving ones. My own retirement was no longer a distant, golden horizon. It was a deadline, a final appointment with the thing that sat in the cold office, waiting patiently to collect its due. Arthur Coleman's investigation had led him from professional curiosity to existential terror. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. He had witnessed the impossible. He now knew he was not working for a man, but for something else. Something that fed on the dedication and longevity of its servants. Join us for the final part of his testimony, where Arthur discovers a desperate message from the pasta set of rules for survival he would come to know as the Wilderness Protocol. You are listening to the final installment of the testimony of Arthur Coleman. In the first two parts of his account, Mr. Coleman detailed his growing terror over 20 years of service at the Northern Geological Archive. He described his supervisor, Mr. Alastair Finch, as a seemingly immortal figurehead man who had not aged since the 1970s. His own clandestine investigation confirmed his fears. He uncovered a history of long-serving predecessors who met with swift, tragic ends shortly after retirement, and he personally witnessed Mr. Finch display impossible strength and an unnatural aura. Arthur now knew he was not merely an employee. He was being cultivated for some terrible purpose. As he entered his final decade of service, the question was no longer if his time would run out, but how he could possibly escape it. We now present the conclusion of his story. The final 10 years of my career, from 2008 to 2018, were not lived, but endured. The knowledge of what Mr. Finch was had transformed the quiet, orderly archive into a perfectly designed prison. It was a cage I shared with a predator of unimaginable patience. My work, once a source of professional pride, became a performancia meticulous, soul-crushing masquerade of normalcy. Every polite "good morning, Mr. Finch" was a carefully rehearsed line, delivered with a heart full of cold dread. I was now in my 50s, the senior man on the floor. I had become one of the old-timers I had once observed, and with that seniority came a new horror. I began to see the cycle anew, through a fresh pair of eyes. A young man named Thomas Reed was hired in 2012. He was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly captivated by the archive's mystique. He was me 30 years ago, and to my abject terror, I saw Mr. Finch take a special interest in him. It was a subtle, predatory grooming, the exact same process I must have undergone without any awareness. Mr. Finch would single Thomas out for praise in staff meetings. He granted him access to the rarest collections in the vault, projects that should have been reserved for more senior staff. I would watch through the glass partition of my office as Mr. Finch beckoned Thomas into his own cold, sterile room. I'd see them bent over ancient, brittle maps, the timeless director and his new, eager protégé, and I would feel a visceral terror grip me. The next vintage was being cultivated. Thomas was my replacement, not just for my job, but for the terrible tribute Finch would eventually collect. My investigation had stalled. The paper trail of personnel files and obituaries had told me what happened, but not how or why. I needed a human voice, a testament from someone else who had seen. I needed to know what had truly happened to my predecessor, Joseph Miller, the man whose mind had allegedly dissolved into Alzheimer's just years after leaving Finch's influence. His obituary had listed his daughter's name, Catherine. After months of painstaking, after-hours searching through online directories, property records, and social media's nascent tendrils, I found her. She was a librarian living in Oregon. With trembling hands, I wrote her a letter. It was a carefully constructed lie. I told her I was compiling a commemorative history for the archive's 75th anniversary and wished to include a heartfelt tribute to her father's 4 decades of dedicated service. I asked, delicately, if he had left behind any work journals, correspondence, or mementos she might be willing to share, for which the archive would be eternally grateful. I sealed the envelope and sent it, expecting nothing. It was a shot in the absolute dark. 3 weeks later, a padded mailer arrived at my home. The return address was Catherine Miller's. My heart hammered against my ribs. Inside was a polite, slightly melancholy letter. She thanked me for remembering her father. She explained that in his final years, he had become deeply paranoid and reclusive, and had burned most of his personal papers in a series of agitated episodes. But she had found one item he had overlooked, tucked away in a box of old tax returns in the attic. It was an old, leather-bound ledger he seemed to have kept during his last year at the archive. She warned me that it was mostly incoherent, the ramblings of a sick mind, but that I was welcome to it. That night, after my wife and children were sound asleep, I poured a large whiskey, sat in my locked study, and opened Joseph Miller's final journal. The pages were brittle. The ink bled in places, but the handwriting was a frantic, desperate scrawl. And as I read, the blood in my veins turned to ice. It was not incoherent. It was a Rosetta Stone for my own terror. It was a warning. It was a manual for survival he called the Wilderness Protocol. Joseph had seen it all. He had worked under Finch since the late 1940s and had watched him evolve from the serious young man I saw in the photographs to the frozen, ageless figure of authority. He had conducted the same fearful research, had uncovered the same pattern of sudden death among his own predecessors. But his journal went further. "He is not a man," Joseph wrote, his pen digging into the page. "He is a being of stasis and cold. The archive is not his office. It is his larder. He is a geologist of a different sort. He does not study the Earth's strata, but the strata of a human life. He is drawn to order, to dedication, to the slow, steady current of a mind devoted to a single, meticulous purpose. He cultivates this quality in his chosen vessel. He nurtures it. For decades." The journal described Finch's nature in terrifyingly familiar detail. His immunity to cold, his unnatural strength, his lack of need for sustenance. Joseph theorized he was a psychic parasite, a being that fed not on blood or tissue, but on something far more esoteric, a life's accumulated potential. The weight of experience, the depth of specialized knowledge, the very energy of a focused mind. "The feeding happens at the end," the entry continued, chilling me to the bone. "The retirement is the ritual, the gold watch, the laudatory speech, the final handshake. It is a transfer. He takes the sum of your years, your devotion, your intimate knowledge of this place. He absorbs it, and it renews him. It maintains his physical stasis, and it leaves the vessel an empty shell. Your mind, your memories, they are scoured clean. You are left with just enough of a ghost to find your way home, to settle your affairs, before the final, merciful darkness. The rapid dementia, the sudden stroke. It is the terminal symptom of having been erased." I dropped the journal on my desk, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. The retirement parties. They were always late on a Friday afternoon, as the winter sun was setting. They always culminated in the same way. Mr. Finch delivering a formal speech, presenting the gold watch, and then a firm, final handshake. The seal on the transaction. The rest of the journal laid out the protocol. A desperate, paranoid set of rules for survival. Rule 1. Never reveal your knowledge. He is a master of surfaces, a reader of intent. He is not humanly perceptive. He is predatorily perceptive. If he confirms you know the truth, he will simply accelerate the timetable. Your sudden resignation due to a family emergency will be announced. You will not be seen again. Rule 2. Mimic his order. He is drawn to patterns. Become a perfect pattern. Keep your workspace immaculate. Fulfill your duties with passionless precision. Give him no professional anomaly to focus on. Become a book on a shelf, not a man in a room. Rule 3. Avoid his touch. This rule was underlined 3 times, the ink nearly tearing the page. The handshake is the conduit. Avoid it at all costs. Feign a cough into your hand. Carry a stack of files. Spill your coffee. Do anything. Any physical contact, I suspect, strengthens the connection he is weaving. Rule 4. disrupt the narrative. He feeds on singular, focused devotion. In your final years, you must deliberately dilute the vintage. Cultivate chaotic, useless passions. Let your work become just a job, not your life's purpose. Joseph wrote that he had failed at this. The archive had been his entire world, making him a perfect, potent meal. Have a secret inner life, he urged. Let your mind be a messy, unpredictable garden, not a manicured lawn. Give him nothing pure to consume. Rule 5. Use the next vessel as cover. He is a creature of immense focus, but that focus is singular. As he begins to cultivate the new crop, his attention on the ripened one will wane. The grooming of your replacement is your window of opportunity. His distraction is your shield. Rule 6. Do not retire. Escape. You cannot win a formal departure. The game is rigged. You must abandon your life. Take nothing that can be traced. Liquidate assets into cash, slowly over months. Create a false destination and go to the opposite. Become a ghost. Rule 7. Warn the next. This was the final, shaky entry. I have failed. My mind is already sand, slipping through my fingers. The words, they scatter. I will hide this journal. I pray it is found. If you are reading this, you are the one I failed to warn directly. You are my final act of defiance. Follow the protocol, and find a way to warn the one who comes after you. I closed the journal, my body trembling uncontrollably. This was it. The insane truth laid bare. I looked at the calendar on my study wall. My retirement party was scheduled in 6 months. I began to live by the protocol. My desk at the archive became a shrine to sterile order. I became a ghost in the machine, my work perfect and passionless. I began taking up hobbies with a desperate, manic energy. I started building intricate ships in bottles, a task of maddening, useless precision. I took up watercolor painting, creating messy, chaotic landscapes. I studied ancient Sanskrit, filling my mind with characters and concepts utterly alien to my work. My mind became a messy, unpredictable garden. Avoiding his touch was the hardest part. One afternoon, he came to my desk to review a document, then extended his hand to return it. My heart seized. I accidentally knocked a cup of pens off my desk, forcing me to duck down as he was reaching out. He was forced to place the document on the desk. When I stood back up, he gave me a long, still, unblinking look. His pale eyes were like chips of ice. For a terrifying second, I was sure he knew. But then his gaze shifted, his attention already back on his own inscrutable affairs. His focus was on Thomas. I prepared my escape. I sold my father's old stamp collection for cash. I slowly withdrew my savings, a few $100s at a time. I booked a 2-week vacation to Florida for my wife and me, a trip I never intended to take, creating a paper trail to a false destination. I packed one bag, the cash, Joseph's journal, a change of clothes, and a set of fake identification I had spent $1,000 on. I wrote a letter to my wife, the hardest thing I have ever done. A letter full of lies about a mental breakdown, about needing to find myself, about being sorry. A letter designed to break her heart, but to keep her and my children safe by making them believe I had left them, not that I had been taken. My last day was a Tuesday in the dead of winter, 3 days before my scheduled retirement party. I couldn't wait any longer. I walked through the silent, humming halls one last time. As I was heading for the door, I passed Mr. Finch's office. He was standing there, looking out his heavily UV-filtered window at the snow-blanketed forest. As if sensing my presence, he turned. His pale eyes met mine. They held no emotion, just a cold, ancient stillness. "Arthur," he said, his voice as smooth and placid as a frozen lake. "You're leaving early." My blood ran cold. The protocol. He knows. Ah, yes. Just a doctor's appointment, Mr. Finch. I stammered, my voice a pathetic squeak. A final checkup before the big day. He smiled. It was the first time in 30 years I had ever seen him truly smile. It was a thin, razor-sharp line that did not touch his eyes. It was the smile of a scientist observing a specimen's failed attempt to escape its petri dish. A smile of absolute knowledge. "Of course," he said, the baritone voice now laced with something that sounded like amusement. "Get some rest. We have much to celebrate on Friday." I nodded, unable to speak, and turned and walked out of the Northern Geological Archive. I did not run. I forced myself to walk, feeling his cold, knowing eyes on my back with every step. I got in my car and drove south, and I did not stop driving for 2 days. I am telling this story now because of Rule 7. Joseph Miller died trying to warn me. I am honoring his final act of defiance. I left his journal back in the archive, tucked away in the same hidden place he described for Thomas. I can only pray he finds it. Do not be fooled by the quiet places of the world. Do not be fooled by the illusion of permanence. Some things do not age because they are not meant to live. They are meant only to endure, and they endure by consuming lives like mine. This concludes the testimony of Arthur Coleman. We have not been able to contact him since receiving his manuscript. The package it arrived in had no return address and was postmarked from a small, dusty town hundreds of miles from his stated vacation destination. Whether this is the confession of a man suffering a profound psychological collapse or a genuine warning from the sole survivor of an encounter with the truly inexplicable, we cannot say. But his story serves as a chilling reminder. The wilderness is not just a place of trees and rock, but of deep time and ancient secrets that defy human understanding. Thank you for listening to the Wilderness Protocol. If you value these accounts, please subscribe and share this testimony. Stay vigilant. The world is older and stranger than we are taught.